There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from quiet. It comes from something breaking, a belief, a version of a person you thought you knew, a story you told yourself for years to make the hurt make sense. That's the silence I remember most from that Sunday afternoon. Not peaceful, not still, the kind that rings. I was 31 years old, sitting at my parents' dining room table in the same chair I'd sat in since I was 7, eating the same pot roast my mother made every Sunday, and I asked a simple question, a reasonable question, the kind of question that should have had a simple answer. I said, "Did you send in the authorization form? The deadline was Friday." My father set down his fork. My mother looked at her plate. And my brother. He was sitting across from me, reaching for the bread basket. He just kept reaching, like I hadn't said anything at all. That was when I knew. Let me back up because the form matters, and why I needed someone else to handle it matters, and why I trusted them to handle it that matters most of all. I had been working 2 jobs for most of my late 20s. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because it explains everything that came after. I was a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown Monday through Friday, and I waitressed Friday and Saturday nights at a restaurant about 3 miles from my apartment. I did this for 4 years. I paid off my student loans. I saved enough for a down payment on a small condo. I built something from nothing, mostly alone, in a city where nothing is cheap and nobody gives you anything. My brother had a different trajectory. He's 4 years older than me and I love him. I want to be clear about that. But he's always been the one my parents caught when he fell. When he lost his job in 2019, they let him move back home. When his truck needed a new transmission, my dad wrote the check. When he wanted to start a landscaping business and then didn't, the startup money they gave him just sort of disappeared and nobody talked about it. I didn't resent any of that, not really. Every family has a pattern. I had just accepted that I wasn't the one the net was for. What I didn't accept, what I never saw coming, was what happened with the property. My grandmother passed away 2 years ago. She left behind a small house about 40 minutes outside of the city, the house my mother grew up in. Nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, old hardwood floors, a back porch that sagged a little on the left side. But it was hers, and then it was ours to figure out. My mother was the sole heir, which meant my mother got to decide what happened to it. The original plan, the plan my mother told me about at my grandmother's kitchen table the week after the funeral, while we packed up dishes and newspaper, was to keep it in the family, rent it out to cover the taxes and upkeep, and eventually, when the time was right, transfer it to me and my brother jointly. Equal shares. That was what she said. I remember the exact light in that kitchen, the smell of old paper and dried herbs. I believed her completely. For 2 years, I managed that rental. I found a tenant, I handled the lease agreement. I was the one who drove out there when the water heater went, when the gutters needed clearing, when the tenant had questions that required an actual human being to answer. I did this while working my 2 jobs, while maintaining my own apartment, while quietly planning for a future that I believed included that house as part of my foundation. My brother would sometimes come with me. He was good company on those drives. We'd stop at the same gas station off Route 9 and get bad coffee, and he'd tell me about whatever he was working on, whatever had his attention that month. I liked those drives. I thought we were in it together. About 8 months ago, I had a work conflict that overlapped with a filing deadline for the County Property Records Office, a routine authorization form that needed to be submitted to update the contact information on the property account. It was administrative, completely mundane. I had filled out most of the form already. I just needed someone to drop it off in person because I was going to be in depositions all day. The office was 10 minutes from my parents' house. I asked my father. He said, of course, no problem, he'd take care of it. I went to work. I sat through 6 hours of depositions. I came home, heated up leftovers, and went to sleep thinking the form was handled. It was handled, just not the way I thought. I didn't find out until that Sunday. And the reason I found out was because I mentioned, casually, over pot roast, that the tenant had given notice and I was planning to list the property again in the spring. I said I'd need to update the contact information officially before we could sign a new lease. My father set down his fork. My mother looked at her plate. My brother reached for the bread. "What?" I said, not loud, just that one word. My father said, "We need to talk about the house." I put my own fork down. Something cold moved through my chest. I looked at my brother, and he was looking at the table, and that was when I understood, before anyone said another word, that something had already been done, something I didn't know about, something I couldn't undo by asking nicely. My father told me that when he went to the county office 8 months ago, he hadn't just dropped off the form, he had submitted a different form. One that transferred the listed contact and management authority on the property solely to my brother. He said it was because my brother needed a fresh start. He said my brother had been talking about using the rental income to get back on his feet, and they thought it made sense to give him something with more responsibility, something to manage. I sat there. I think I nodded, which is a strange thing to do when someone has just told you something like that. But I nodded, slowly, like I was processing a math problem instead of the fact that my father had driven 10 minutes from his house and signed away my access to a property I'd been managing for 2 years, without telling me, without asking me, as a solution to my brother's problems. "The property is still in Mom's name," my father said. "Nothing is finalized, we just thought." "You thought," I said. He stopped. My mother finally looked up. She said, "You've always been the capable one, you don't need it the way he does." I want to sit with that sentence for a second, because I've thought about it almost every day since. You've always been the capable one. What she meant, as a compliment, was actually a confession. What she was telling me, without realizing it, was that my competence had been working against me my entire life. That every time I handled something myself, every time I didn't ask for help, every time I figured it out, I was quietly proving that I didn't need to be caught, and so they never built a net for me. I thought about every drive out to that house, every phone call with the tenant, every time I had rearranged my schedule, taken a half day, driven 40 minutes in Friday afternoon traffic because something needed to be done and I was the one who did things. I thought about my brother reaching for the bread. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I excused myself from the table. I said, "Excuse me," like I was getting up to use the restroom, like this was a pause and not an ending. And I walked through the kitchen, picked up my keys and my coat from the hook by the door, and I left. I sat in my car in their driveway for a while, not thinking clearly exactly, more like letting things settle. The pot roast was still warm in my stomach. The porch light was on. It was the same house I grew up in, and it looked completely unfamiliar. I drove home. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney, not to threaten anyone, not yet, but because I needed to understand exactly what had been done and what my options were. I had copies of the original form I had filled out. I had email records showing 2 years of my involvement in managing the property. I had text messages from my brother saying, "I'll follow your lead on this one," in reference to the spring tenant search. I had built, without meaning to, a fairly detailed paper trail. The attorney was thorough. She explained that the form my father had submitted transferred management authority, not ownership. My mother still held the deed. What had happened was serious, but not irreversible. What would happen next depended on whether my mother was willing to clarify her original intentions in writing. "Do you think she will?" the attorney asked. I thought about my mother looking at her plate. "I don't know," I said. I called my mother that evening. I didn't call my father. I didn't call my brother. I called her because she was the one who had sat with me in that kitchen after the funeral and told me about equal shares, and I needed to know if that memory was real or if I had invented it. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I wasn't calling to argue. I told her I just needed to understand what she actually wanted to happen with the house. I kept my voice very even. I had practiced the sentences on my lunch break, which sounds calculated but was actually just self-preservation. I knew that if I went in without a plan, I would end up apologizing for being upset, which was a pattern I was trying to break. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know he was going to submit a different form. I thought he was just dropping off what you had prepared." That landed somewhere behind my sternum, because it meant my father had made that decision alone, without telling my mother, without telling me. He had driven to the county office, looked at the form I filled out, decided it wasn't what he wanted, and submitted something else, and then come home and not said a word to anyone for 8 months. "Did he tell you afterward?" I asked. Another pause. "He mentioned it. I didn't ask too many questions." I understood then that this wasn't a conspiracy. It was something almost worse. It was a pattern so ingrained that nobody had even thought to examine it. My brother needed something. My father found a way to give it to him. My mother didn't push back, and because I was the capable one, because I had always handled my own things, I wasn't even part of the calculation. The conversation with my mother was the last one I had with any of them for a while. Not because I issued an ultimatum, not because I said anything dramatic. I just stopped reaching, stopped being available. Let the Sunday calls go to voicemail. Let the group chat notifications pile up. I focused on what I could control. I filed a formal statement with my attorney documenting my management history and my mother's original verbal agreement. I had a follow-up meeting where my attorney confirmed that if my mother was willing to formalize her original intention, the management authority could be corrected. If she wasn't, my options were more complicated, more expensive, and more painful for everyone. My mother agreed to sign the corrective documentation. I don't know what my father said when she told him. I don't know what my brother said. I wasn't there, and I didn't ask, because I had started to understand that I had been spending enormous amounts of energy tracking the emotional weather in that family for my entire adult life, trying to anticipate what people needed so I could provide it before they even had to ask. And I was tired. I was so genuinely tired. The corrective paperwork was filed 6 weeks after that Sunday lunch. During those 6 weeks, my brother texted me once. He said, "I didn't know Dad was going to do that. I want you to know that." I read it several times. I believed him, actually. I think he knew something was going on, but not the specifics. I think he had let our father handle it the way he'd always let our father handle things. I texted back, "I know." 2 words. I wasn't ready for more than that, and I didn't pretend to be. My father hasn't reached out directly. I don't know what that means about him or about us. I've decided for now not to interpret it. Some things take time to understand, and some things you never understand completely, and I have learned to tell the difference between a mystery worth solving and one worth letting rest. There's a version of this story where I forgive everyone quickly, and we all gather around that same dining room table and things go back to the way they were. I've thought about that version. I understand its appeal. It would be easier in the short term. It would feel like resolution. But there's something I've had to reckon with, which is that the table I keep imagining going back to was never exactly safe. The dynamic that allowed my father to do what he did without thinking twice, that didn't appear from nowhere. It was built over years of small moments where my capability was treated as a reason to need me less, where my brother's struggles were treated as a reason to give him more, where equity was never quite the measure anyone was using, even when they said it was. Going back to that table, without anything having shifted, would mean agreeing to live inside that dynamic again. And I'm not sure I can do that. I'm not sure I can. The house goes back on the rental market next month. I'll manage it again. I never stop knowing how. The tenant we lost was a good one, and I spent some time genuinely regretting that the uncertainty during those months probably contributed to their decision to leave. That felt like a practical loss, separate from the emotional one. I have a folder of applications already. I know what I'm doing. I've always known what I'm doing. That's the part that still gets me sometimes, in quiet moments. I have always known what I'm doing. And somehow, for a very long time, I let that be used as a reason to give me less. There's a kind of freedom in recognizing a pattern. It doesn't fix anything exactly. The hurt is still there and the table is still there, and my father's silence is still there like a room with the door closed. But when you can see the shape of something clearly, you can decide how much space to give it. You can decide what you're willing to carry and what you're finally willing to set down. I set a lot of things down that Sunday afternoon, in the driveway, in my car with the engine off and the porch light on. I didn't know, at the time, that was what I was doing. I do now. What my mother said that afternoon, "You've always been the capable one." I keep turning it over like a stone, looking at what's underneath it. She meant it kindly. I know that. She thought she was describing something good about me, something that set me apart. But what she was actually describing was the logic the whole system ran on. I was capable, so I didn't need protecting. My brother struggled, so he did. And because that equation had always balanced. Because I had always, in the end, figured things out. Nobody ever stopped to ask whether the equation was fair. Or whether I was tired. Or whether I capable had become a reason to take from me rather than a reason to trust me. That's the cause and effect nobody talks about when they talk about family dynamics. Every time I handled something without complaint, I was teaching them that I didn't need to be considered. Every time I absorbed a disappointment quietly, I was confirming that I could absorb it again. The result wasn't random. It was built slowly out of 100 moments where I proved I could manage, and they learned they didn't have to manage for me. The outcome that Sunday wasn't a surprise. It was an arrival. We had all been heading there for years. I've thought a lot about what it means to act with integrity inside a situation that isn't fair. Because I could have blown that table apart. I had the documentation, the history, the standing. I could have made it loud and ugly and final in a single afternoon. There was a version of me, maybe a few years younger, who would have. But I've come to believe that how you respond to betrayal says something permanent about who you are. Not to the people who betrayed you, but to yourself. I left that table quietly, not because I was weak, but because I knew exactly what I was doing and exactly what I was worth. And I didn't need to perform either one for an audience that had already decided what I was. That's a kind of clarity it took me a long time to find. Knowing the difference between backing down and choosing not to escalate. Knowing that silence can be strength and not just surrender. I had to think my way through the anger to get there. Look at what had actually happened, what I could actually prove, what I actually wanted the outcome to be. That took more out of me than shouting would have. It required me to be honest about what I knew and what I didn't, about what my brother understood and what my father had decided alone, about what my mother was complicit in and what she simply hadn't examined. And then there's the part about continuing, filing the paperwork, showing up to the attorney's office, returning the calls, staying functional inside something that hurt. That part doesn't get enough credit. It's easy to talk about the dramatic moments, the silence at the table, the keys off the hook, the drive home. But the actual work of not letting something take you down is quieter and longer and more exhausting than any single scene. It's just getting up the next morning and making the next right move. Again, again, again. The property situation is corrected now. The paperwork is filed. I have what I was owed. I'm still deciding what I want the relationship to look like from here. That's a separate question, and I'm letting myself take time with it. What I know is that I'm not going back to the version of that table where my capability was the tax I paid for being love. If we find a new table, a different kind of Sunday, a different kind of honest, I'm open to that. But I'm not pretending the old one was fine.